What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Let's Play Dear Esther. I know at the end of the last episode, I said I would use this episode to talk a little bit more about the story of Dear Esther, but I kind of just realized that there's a little bit more that I want to get off my chest. But I know there's a narration point coming up soon, so I'll just stow that for a moment.
I've begun my ascent on the windless slope of the western side. The setting sun was an inflamed eye squeezing shut against the light shone in by the doctors. My neck is aching through constantly craning my head up to track the light of the aerial. I must look downwards, follow the path under the island to a new beginning.
The most challenging thing about doing this game is that I'm constantly, in the back of my mind, I'm constantly thinking, wait, is there a narration point coming up? How long is it going to last? How long between the narration triggers? Do I have time to say this or that? Oh god, it's driving me insane. And, as I might get to in this episode, I'm eventually going to point out that the narration might not even be all that important. But anyway.
The bothy was constructed originally in the early 1700s. By then, shepherding had formalized into a career. The first habitual shepherd was a man called Jakobsen, from a lineage of migratory Scandinavians. He was not considered a man of breeding by the mainlanders. He came here every summer whilst building the bothy, hoping eventually that becoming a man of property would secure him a wife and a lineage. Donnelly records that it did not work. He caught some disease from his malcontented goats and died 2 years after completing it. There was no one to carve white lines into the cliff for him either.
So before I get into anything else about the thing that I really was thinking about a moment ago, last episode I pointed out that there are random items and the narration points are semi-randomized. There's also a few other things that pop up around the island. There are silhouette people, which are just distant outlines, black outlines of people you can see in the distance sometimes. They seem to be random, or at least random in the same way the narration is. And I'll point them out if I see them. I'm obviously a little distracted to notice very, very tiny details in the distance. But if you look for them, they will be there.
My heart is landfill. These false dawns waking into the still never light. I sweat for you in the small hours and wrap my blankets into a mass. I've always heard the waves break on these lost shores, always the gulls forgotten. I can lift this bottle to my ear, and all there ever is for me is this Hebridean music.
There are also ghosts, which I believe spawn in fixed points around the island. And obviously they're opaque, so they're a little hard to notice sometimes. They're also not placed directly in front of you. And I don't actually know where all of them spawn. I'm sure we've passed a lot of them so far since we're well over a third of the way through the game. This is going to take probably 3 episodes, maybe the better part of 3, but definitely not 4. So the thing that... This is kind of a continuation of what I was talking about in the last episode. And this topic always seems to find a way under my skin. And it's this baggage that we bring to the table about what gameplay is and how important it is to a game. And on one hand, I agree that clinging to the name video games might be damaging because it's filled with preconceptions and connotations.
Jakobsen's ribcage, they told Donnelly, was deformed, the result of some birth defect or perhaps a traumatic injury as a child. Brittle and overblown it was, and desperately light. Perhaps it was this that finally did for him, unable to contain the shattering of his heart. In half-light, his skeleton a discarded prop, a false and calcified seabird.
I'm not a huge fan of the word gameplay either because they're so finicky. Games imply fun, but I don't know, is there a better word for that? Interactive experience is one that's always been brought up, but that feels even less precise than game and gameplay. And it also sounds kind of pretentious, or at least to me.
They found Jakobsen in early spring. The thaw had only just come. Even though he'd been dead nearly 7 months, his body had been frozen right down to the nerves and had not even begun to decompose. He'd struggled halfway down the cliff path, perhaps looking for some lost goat, or perhaps in a delirium, and expired, curled into a claw right under the winter moon. Even the animals shunned his corpse. The mainlanders thought to bring it home unlucky. Donnelly claims they dragged it to the caves to thaw out and rot, but he is proving an unreliable witness.
So I don't know, like, is it the word or the wording that needs to change, or do we just need to get over those preconceptions, or gameplay feels especially imprecise. It's just this really weird way of boiling everything down. But they're so easy and so convenient.
Climbing down to the caves, I slipped and fell and have injured my leg. I think the femur is broken. It is clearly infected. The skin has turned a bright, tight pink, and the pain is crashing in on waves, winter tides against my shoreline, drowning out the ache of my stones. I struggled back to the bothy to rest, but it has become clear that there is only one way this is likely to end. The medical supplies I looted from the trawler have suddenly found their purpose. They will keep me lucid for my final ascent.
Like, it's so easy to just say, I liked it because the gameplay was good, or I didn't like it because the gameplay was bad. And it's boiling down the entire interactive element of a game down into one word, which just seems mental in a way. I mean, that's all aside from how clunky it sounds. It's weirdly unique in that you don't hear it anywhere else. World War Z doesn't have good book read, but we have a unique way of interacting with games, so it kind of justifies it. It's, yeah, my big hang-up is with the imprecision.
Did Jakobsen crawl this far? Can I identify the scratches his nails ruined into the rocks? Am I following him cell for cell, inch for inch? Why did he turn back on himself and not carry through to the ascent?
Gameplay, mechanics, rules of play. We invented these terms or appropriated them to describe the sum total of the interactive elements of a genre that is unique in exactly that way. The way we interact with this medium is inherently different. Films we interact with by watching, books we interact with by reading, games we interact with by doing. Even when our agency over events is limited and our choice is pretty much just whether or not to progress, just as it would be with a book where your only choice is to turn the page or put it down, our input is still necessary, and that changes how even a linear cross-section of a game plays out, even if only in a small way. Like I said, maybe the problem is just our expectations of what games or gameplay should entail.
They'd stop the traffic back as far as the Sandford Junction and come up the hard shoulder like radio signals from another star. It took 21 minutes for them to arrive. I watched Paul time it to the second on his watch.
If we're sticking with the phrase gameplay, though, just for the purposes of convenience, I wouldn't say Dear Esther has bad gameplay or weak mechanics, because what interactive elements are there aside from moving forward with the arrow keys? Those mechanics, that mechanic works just fine. It's technically sound, there's consistent internal logic at play, and that's really it. It's not bad, it's minimalist. That doesn't mean any game with minimal gameplay is good because there's so little to screw up, just that using that one criterion as our primary tool for assessing how good or bad the whole package is flawed. Sure, it's valid to say that Dear Esther is boring, but you have to look further than just good or bad gameplay to justify that. If Dear Esther is boring because of the minimalist agency you have, or the simple mechanic of just moving, then no movie or book should be able to satisfy you either, right? Because there you have even less agency, you have even less to do. There's even less input that whatever the movie, the book, or whatever is getting from you. Frame it this way. Would Dear Esther, The Path, or any other games like it with minimal gameplay be agreeable to you if they were films or any media that you consume, more passively? If so, the problem with Dear Esther is, if there is one, isn't the gameplay. That's baggage that you're bringing to the table. That is the hypothetical you that doesn't like this game or games like it. Who knows? You might actually love it. Anyway, the problem is that we're so used to assessing games with these really imprecise tools and basing our opinions around what's going on mechanically and such, that when a game comes along and its strengths lie elsewhere, we fall back on tools that aren't appropriate for the job. Talking about the quality of Dear Esther by assessing its gameplay is like trying to pry a nail loose with a tape measure. The thing is, if games are made unique by virtue of the interaction that they make possible, shouldn't we judge their merits based on the interactive elements? And that's a really good question. It's tough, too. I called it sketchy territory earlier because it's not entirely untrue, but what constitutes sufficient gameplay then? Again, where is that line between what enough gameplay is and what isn't to constitute the difference between a game and something that's...
body, following the line of infection from the shattered femur towards the heart. I swallow fistfuls of painkillers to stay lucid. In my delirium, I see the twin lights of the moon and the Ariel shining to me through the rocks.
Not a game. And the best I can offer up there is that the question is complicated by the fact that this medium has evolved faster than the vocabulary we use to talk about it. This wouldn't be an argument 10 or 15 years ago, but now we have these things with strengths and weaknesses in vastly different areas. Michael Abbott of Brainy Gamer posted an article, I think 2 years ago, on El Shaddai and how all the things we would normally use to judge a game, how good the platforming is, how good the combat is, in El Shaddai, those are all flawed. They're weaker elements of the game, and yet it triumphed in his assessment by way of its aesthetic, by way of elements outside of the mechanical. And I guess if there's anything to take away from this, it's that gameplay is not the be-all, end-all. If that's what the focus is on, sure, the game should be judged on that. It's one criteria, though. It's one tool in the box. I think one important use of gameplay as a criteria to judge a game is how well it services the rest of the game.
When I was coming round from the operation, I remember the light they shone in my eyes to check for pupil contraction. It was like staring up at a moonlit sky from the bottom of a well. People moved at the summit, but I could not tell if you were one of them.
That's where judging the quality of it is actually most important. Does it facilitate the whole experience, or does it distract? Bad mechanics and weak gameplay that create a rift between that aspect of the game and the rest is a good reason to criticize gameplay. This is actually where I disagree with Abbott. He doesn't deny El Shaddai's mechanical weaknesses, the clunky platforming, the mashy combat, although he doesn't confirm that these were issues for him either, by the way. So I don't know whether or not they even registered as poor for him. But the point seemed to be that El Shaddai could be considered great based on other merits in spite of one mace of the gameplay, even if that gameplay is weak. If there's something there to judge, in my evaluation, judge it. If it proves sufficiently weak as to distract you from what's good about the game, then it's damaging the overall experience, and thus the overall experience should be evaluated with that taken into account. I agree that gameplay is not the be-all end-all, but it has to factor in, especially if it's prominent enough to weaken or enhance the game. Gameplay can't just sabotage other elements of the game and not be called out for doing so. And that is where I would disagree with Abbott, at least as far as El Shaddai goes. I did find that the gameplay sabotaged the experience. One of the advantages of having minimalist gameplay is that there's a lower chance of weak gameplay diminishing the strengths of the game. By the way, this isn't a defense of Dear Esther or anything like it. A lot of people find it to be boring, and honestly, I think so too, at least to some degree. Some people really hate it because it's boring. And I can understand that, but I feel less strongly at least. But I still do agree that it's kind of boring. But what I want to emphasize is that it's not boring just because of its gameplay. There's a lot more going on that makes it so. I also want to say this. It's boring, but I still think that it triumphs in a few ways, including in its aesthetic and in its writing. And it takes a bit for the tedium to set in, so it's still enjoyable to gaze at the sights for a little while before doing that gets dull. There's nothing wrong with disliking something. I'm not trying to convince you to like Dear Esther, but maybe reconsider what it is about it that you don't like. Of course, if you only like games where the focus is gameplay, and you don't like other styles of games or approaches, there's nothing wrong with that either. And in that case, yeah, the gameplay of Dear Esther, or lack thereof, the minimalism, is probably going to be the root of a lot of your issues with it. If you're coming to the table wanting just that, then yeah, Dear Esther is not going to scratch your itch. And that's understandable enough. Now, in the next episode, since we are quickly running out of time, I will offer up on what ground I will defend Dear Esther on. And I will keep my promise next episode to actually talk about the story, because aside from one short little aside that's going to take like 1 minute to get out of my system, yeah, it's all story from here on out. So, thanks for watching, guys. Take it easy. Have a good one.